23. The development of African historiography. J. D. Fage. The writing of African history is as old as the writing of history itself. The historians of the ancient Mediterranean world and those of the medieval Islamic civilization both took the whole known world as their frame of reference, and this included a considerable part of Africa. Africa north of the Sahara was an integral part of both civilizations, and its past was as much a concern of their historians as was that of southern Europe or the Near East. Indeed, North African history continued to be part of the mainstream of Western historical studies until the advance of the Ottoman Turkish Empire in the 16th century. Following the Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798, North Africa became again a not inconsiderable field for investigation by historians. With the growth of European colonial power in North Africa following the French conquest of Algiers in 1830 and the British occupation of Egypt in 1882, a European, colonialist standpoint came to dominate the writing of North African history. However, by the 1930s the modernist movement in Islam, the growth of European-style education in the North African colonies, and the rise of North African nationalist movements were all combining to produce indigenous schools of historians, writing in French and English as well as in Arabic, to restore a proper balance to North African historical studies. This chapter will therefore mainly concern itself with the historiography of West, Central, East and Southern Africa. Neither the classical European nor the medieval Islamic historians were uninterested in tropical Africa, but their horizons were limited by the extent of the contacts that were made with it, whether across the Sahara to Ethiopia or the Bilad al-Sudan, or down the Red Sea and Indian Ocean coasts to the limits of monsoon navigation. The ancient authors' information was scanty and fitful, especially in relation to West Africa. Herodotus, Menathon, the elder Pliny, Strabo and some others tell us little more than of occasional journeys or raids across the Sahara, or of maritime tentatives down the Atlantic coast, and the authenticity of some of these accounts is often the subject of lively dispute among modern scholars. Classical information concerning the Red Sea and Indian Ocean is more soundly based, for it is plain that Mediterranean, or at least Alexandrian, merchants were developing trade on these coasts. The R. Methodology and African Prehistory. Periplues of the Erythraean CCIO of our era and the accounts of Claudius Ptolemy c. 150 of our era, though the version that has come down to us seems to relate more to c. 400 and of Cosmas Indicopleus 647 are still major sources for the early history of East Africa. The Arabic authors were much better informed, for in their time the adoption of the camel by the Saharan peoples had facilitated the establishment of regular commerce with West Africa and the settlement of North African traders in the major towns of the western Sudan, while the trade of the western Indian Ocean had also developed to the point at which considerable colonies of merchants from Arabia and nearer Asia had been established along the East African coast. Thus the writing of men like Al-Masud c. 950 Al-Bakr 1029-94 Al-Idris 1154 Ukut c. 1200 Abu Al-Fida 1273-1331 Al-Umri 1301-49 Ibn Battuta 1304-69 and Al-Hasan Ibn Muhammad Mahdi Al-Waz known to Europe as the Old Africanus, c. 1494-1552 are of major importance for the reconstruction of African history of the period between about the 9th and the 15th centuries, especially the history of the western and central Sudan. But it is doubtful whether any of these authors or of their classical forebears, however useful their writings are to modern historians, should themselves be counted among the major historians of Africa. Essentially what each of them gives is a picture of those parts of Africa for which information was available at the time he was writing. There is no clear investigation, let alone description, of change over time, which is the true purpose of the historian. Nor in fact is a truly synchronic picture given, for while some of the information given may be contemporary, other parts of it, though still current in the author's lifetime, often originated in reports coming from earlier times. The final disadvantage is that commonly there is no means of assessing the authority of the information, whether, for example, the author gathered it from his own first-hand observation, or from the first-hand observation of a contemporary, or merely from current hearsay or from earlier authors. The Old Africa News provides an interesting example of this problem. Like Ibn Battuta, he himself traveled in Africa, but, unlike Ibn Battuta, it is by no means clear that all his information is derived from his own personal observations. It is worth recalling, perhaps, that the word history is not unambiguous. Today its common meaning is something like a methodological account of events over time, but it can also have the older sense of a systematic account of natural phenomena. It is essentially in this sense that it is employed in the English title given to Leo Africanus' work, The Geographical History of Africa, a sense which survives today really only in the obsolescent term natural history which, of course, was Pliny's title. However, there is one major early historian of Africa in the best modern sense. This is Ibn Khaldun (1332–1406) who, if he were better known to Western scholars, might well usurp Herodotus' title of the father of history. Ibn Khaldun was, of course, the North African, the native of Tunis. Part of his 26. The development of African historiography work is concerned with Africa and its relations with the other peoples of the Mediterranean and the Near East. From his perception of these relations, he evolved the concept of history as a cyclical process in which nomads from the steppes and the desert conquer the sedentary peoples of the arable lands, and there set up major kingdoms which, after about 3 generations, lose their vitality, and become victims to fresh invasions of nomads. This, indeed, is not a bad model for much of North African history, and a great historian, Mark Bloch, too, has made use of Ibn Khaldun for his illumination of the history of early medieval Europe. But Ibn Khaldun stands out from his contemporaries not only because he thought out a philosophy of history but also, and perhaps more importantly, because, unlike them, he did not regard all scraps of information about the past as having potentially equal weight and validity. An approach to the truth had to be sought out by processes of criticism and comparison. Ibn Khaldun is in fact a very modern historian, and it is to him that we owe what is almost certainly our earliest surviving fragment of the written history of tropical Africa in any modern sense. As a North African, and also because, however new his philosophy and method, he was also working within the older Mediterranean and Islamic traditions, he was not unmindful of what was going on across the Sahara. Thus one chapter of Ibn Khaldun's work 3 is in effect a history of the empire of Mali, which was at or close to its peak in his lifetime. This is partly based on the oral tradition then current, and for this reason it still remains an essential base for the history of this great African state. Then no powerful state like Mali, or for that matter lesser ones like the early Hausa kingdoms or the city-states of the East African coast, could maintain its identity and integrity if there were not some accepted account of its foundation and subsequent development. When Islam crossed the Sahara and penetrated down the east coast, bringing literacy in Arabic in its train, Negro Africans no longer had to rely on maintaining their histories by oral means, and very quickly took to the production of written histories. Perhaps the most sophisticated early examples of these histories that are now known are the Turkish al-Svedian and the Turkish al-Fattash, both originally composed in Timbuktu essentially in the 17th century. For in both cases the authors give us accounts of developments in or just before their OWM times in considerable detail, and not without analysis and interpretation. But they also preface these with critical accounts of the surviving oral traditions relating to earlier times, so that the end result is not. The principal passages relating to Africa are to be found in Ibn Khaldun's most important work, the Muqaddimah, translated into French by Vincent Monteil, and in a part of his Universal History, translated by D. Slane under the title Histoire des Berbers. 2. See, for example, M. Bloch, 1939, page 54. 3. In the translation by M. G. D. Slane, entitled Histoire des Berbers, this appears in Volume 2, pages 105–16. 4. The Tarif al-Svedian was edited and translated by G. Hudas 1900. The Tarif al-Fattash by G. Hudas and M. Delafos 1913. 27. Methodology and African Prehistory. Only a history of the Songhai Empire, and of its conquest and domination by the Moroccans, but also an attempt to assess what was significant in the earlier history of the region, notably in the ancient empires of Ghana and Mali. This tends to distinguish the Timbuktu books from other early African historical works in Arabic, such as those known as the Kano Chronicle and the Kilwa Chronicle, which are little more than direct written recordings of traditions which earlier were presumably maintained by oral means. While a version of the Quilwa Chronicle seems to have been used by the Portuguese historian D. Barros in the 16th century, there is no evidence to show that the Quilwa Chronicle existed in the written form before about the 19th century. One point of some interest is that Arabic chronicles of this kind are not necessarily limited to those parts of Africa which became thoroughly Islamized. Thus central modern Ghana produced its Gonda Chronicle Kitab al-Gunja in the 18th century, and the recent researches of Ider Wilkes and others have revealed hundreds of examples of Arabic literacy from this and contiguous areas. 6. It must also not be forgotten, of course, that one part of tropical Africa, the modern Ethiopia, had its own Semitic languages, first Ge'ez and later Amharic, in which a continuous literary tradition has been preserved and developed for some 2 millennia. This tradition was certainly producing historical writing by the 14th century, for example, the Chronicles of the Wars of Samedi. One historical writing in other African languages, such as Hausa and Swahili, as opposed to writing in the imported classical language of Arabic, but using its script, did not develop until the 19th century. In the 15th century, Europeans began to become acquainted with the coastlands of tropical Africa. This quickly led to the production of literary works which provide invaluable source material for modern historians. 4 parts of tropical Africa received particular attention: the Guinea coastlands of West Africa, the region of the Lower Zaire and Angola, the Zambezi Valley and the adjacent islands, and Ethiopia, in the last 3 of which there was appreciable penetration inland in the 16th and 17th centuries. But as with the earlier classical or Arabic writers, the result was not always, or immediately, the writing of African history. The Guinea coastlands were the first part of Africa to be known by Europeans, and from about 1460 to almost to the beginning of the 5. The translation of the Quilwa Chronicle is to be found in H. R. Palmer, 1928, Volume 3, pages 92 to 132, and the Quilwa Chronicle in G. S. P. Freeman Grenfell, 1962, pages 34 to 49. 6. O. M. The Gonda Chronicle and the Collection of Arabic MSS. In Modern Ghana C.N. Levy and 1968, especially pages XVIIXXII, I. Wilkes, 1963, and T. Hodgkin, 1966. 7. There are a number of translations of this work, including one by J. Perukan in Journal Asiatic, 1889. 28. The development of African historiography. 18th century Barbach and Bosman. A whole series of works was written about them. A large amount of this material is of the utmost historical value, providing first-hand and dated evidence to which much of their West African history can be anchored. There is also a good deal of historical as opposed to contemporary material in these works, especially perhaps in Dapper 1668 who, unlike most of the other authors, was not a first-hand observer, but solely a compiler of others' observations. But all these writers set out essentially to describe the contemporary situation rather than to write history, and, perversely, it is only now that a good deal of West African history has been reconstructed, that the full historical significance of much of what they have to say can be properly appreciated. 8. The situation in respect of the other areas in which European interest developed in the 16th and 17th centuries was somewhat different. The explanation may lie in the fact that these were all fields for early missionary endeavor, whereas the prime focus for European activities in Guinea was always trade. So long as Africans delivered the goods which Europeans wanted to buy, as by and large was the case in Guinea, traders felt no imperative to alter African society, they were content simply to observe it. Missionaries, on the other hand, had a positive compulsion to try to change what they found, and perhaps some understanding of African history was a useful asset for them. In Ethiopia, of course, the tools were to-hand. Ge'ez was learned and studied, and chronicles and other writings in it could be used. Historical writing about Ethiopia was undertaken by 2 notable missionary pioneers, Aropes d. 1622 and Manuel d. Almeida 1569–1646, and a full-scale history was written by one of the first of Europe's Orientalists, Job Udolph 1624–1704. 9. In Lower Zaire and Angola, and also in and around the Zambezi Valley, the commercial motive was probably stronger than the evangelistic, but by and large traditional African society could not deliver the goods that Europeans required without considerable pressure. As a result, it was changing dramatically. so that even descriptive essays could hardly escape being in part historical. In fact, there is a considerable amount of history in the books of men like Pigafetta and Lopez 1591 and Cavazzi 1687, while in 1681 Corneta produced a history of the Angolan Wars. 10. By the 18th century, it would seem that tropical Africa was getting its due share of attention from European historians. It was now possible, for example, to use the earlier, essentially descriptive writers like Leo Africanus. 8. G. R. Crone, 1937, J. Barbach, 1732, V.B. Bosman, annotated BDN, 1967. 9. C. Bicari, 1905-17, Pisa's work is involved 2 and 3 and Almeida's involves 5-7, there is a partial English translation of Almeida in C. F. Beckingham and G. W. B. Huntingford, 1954. Budolf's Historia Heliotica was published at Frankfurt in 1681. 10. 8. De Oliveira de Corneta, 1942-2. 29. Methodology and African Prehistory. And Dapper as historical sources, so that the universal histories and geographies of the time, like the universal history produced in England between 1736 and 1765, could give Africa a fair ration of their space. 11. There were also some monographic essays, for example Silvacre's History of Angola c. 1792, Benezet's Some Historical Account of Guinea 1772, and the 2 histories of Dahomey, Norris's Memoirs of the Reign of Baixado 1789 and D'Alto's History of Dahomey 1793. But at this point, caution is necessary. Silvacre's book was not published until the present century. 12. And the reason why the other 3 books mentioned were published is that by the end of the 18th century there was growing controversy about the slave trade, the mainstay of Europe's connection with tropical Africa for the previous 150 or more years. D'Alto and Norris, both drawing on their experience of slave trading in Dahomey, and Benezet, were all writing history, but their writings were all intended to provide fuel for the argument as to whether or not the slave trade should be abolished. If it were not for this fact, it is doubtful whether these books would have found a market, because by this time the mainstream of European scholarship was beginning to take an increasingly unfavorable view of non-European societies, and to assert that they had no history worth studying. Essentially this attitude resulted from a conjunction of streams of thought deriving from the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the growing scientific revolution. The result was that, building upon what was regarded as a unique Greco-Roman heritage, European intellectuals persuaded themselves that the purpose, knowledge, power and wealth of their society were so strong that it must prevail over all others, therefore its history was the key to understanding, and the history of all other societies was irrelevant. This attitude was perhaps especially applicable to Africa, since Europeans by now hardly knew Africa or Africans at all outside the context of the slave trade, while the operations of the export slave trade were creating increasing social chaos in many parts of the continent. Hegel 1770-1831 stated the position very explicitly in his Philosophy of History, which contains such statements as that Africa is not a historical continent, it shows neither change nor development, and that its Negro peoples were capable of neither development nor education. As we see them today, so they have always been. It is interesting to know that, as early as 1793, the editor who prepared D'Alto's book for publication thought it necessary to justify the appearance of a history of Dahomey. He neatly turned Hegel's attitude on its head, declaring, to arrive at a just knowledge of human nature, a progress through the history of the ruder nations is essentially necessary. There is no other way to judge of the value of 11. The folio edition of the Universal History has 23 volumes. Of these, 16 are devoted to modern history, and these include 2 volumes for Africa. 12. Lisbon, 1937. 30. The development of African historiography. Cultivation, in the estimate of human happiness, then by this sort of comparison. 13. Although Hegel's direct influence on the elaboration of African history may have been small, the view he represented became part of the historical orthodoxy of the 19th century, and is not without its adherents even today. The recent Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford University once declared, perhaps, in the future, there will be some African history to teach. But at present there is none. There is only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. Please do not misunderstand me. I do not deny that men existed even in dark countries and dark centuries, nor that they had political life and culture, interesting to sociologists and anthropologists, but history, I believe, is essentially a form of movement, and purposive movement too. It is not a mere phantasmagoria of changing shapes and costumes, of battles and conquests, dynasties and usurpations, social forms and social disintegration. He argued that history, or rather the study of history, has a purpose. We study it in order to discover how we have come to be where we are, and that the present world is so dominated by Western European ideas, techniques and values, that for the last 5 centuries at least, insofar as the history of the world has significance, it is only European history that counts. We cannot therefore afford to amuse ourselves with the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. 14. Ironically enough, it was in Hegel's own lifetime that Europeans entered upon the effective modern, scientific exploration of Africa, and so began to lay the foundations for a rational appraisal of the history and achievements of African societies. In part this exploration was connected with the reaction against slavery and the slave trade, in part with the competition for African markets. Some of the early European travelers were genuinely interested in finding out what they could about the past of the peoples of tropical Africa, and collected all available material, documents if they were available, if not oral traditions and notes on such antiquities as they saw. The literature produced by the explorers is immense, some of it contains some very good history, and almost all of it contains material of great value for historians. A short list of the major landmarks might include James Bruce's travels to discover the source of the Nile 1790, the specifically historical chapters in the accounts of their visits to the Asante capital, Kumasi, by T. E. Bowditch. 13. 8. Alto, The History of Dahomey 1793 p. v. 14. These quotations come from the opening remarks of the first lecture of a series by Professor Hugh Trevor Roper entitled The Rise of Christian Europe. See The Listener, November 28, 1963, page 871. 31. Methodology and African Prehistory. Mission from Cape Coast Castle to Ashanti, 1819, and by Joseph Dupuy, Journal of a Residence in Ashanti, 1824. Heinrich Barb's Travels and Discoveries in North and Central Africa, 1857-8 m. Gui's Documents sur l'histoire, la géographie et le commerce de l'Afrique orientale, 1856, and Gustav Nachtigal's Sahara und Sudan, 1879-89. Nachtigal's career, of course, extended into a totally new phase of Africa's history, that when Europeans had embarked on the processes of conquering the continent and of ruling its peoples. These processes seemed to require a moral justification, and here the Hegelian view was reinforced by the application of Darwinian principles. The symptomatic outcome of this was the rise of the new science of anthropology, a non-historical way of investigating and evaluating the cultures and societies of primitive peoples, those who had no history worth studying, those who were inferior to the Europeans, and who were usefully distinguishable from them by the pigmentation of their skins. An interesting case study here is Richard Burton, 1821-90. Burton's travels rank him among the greatest of the 19th century European travelers in Africa. He had a restless and inquiring mind and high order of scholarship, and was an outstanding Orientalist, and in 1863 he was one of the founders of the London Anthropological Society, which later developed into the Royal Anthropological Institute. Yet, in a much more idiosyncratic way than was the case with Nachtigal, his career marks the end of the period of the dispassionate, scientific exploration of Africa that had begun with James Bruce. There is, for example, in his mission to Glalie, King of Dahomey, 1864, a remarkable digression on the Negro's place in nature, not, it may be noted, the Negro's place in history. In this can be found sentences such as the pure Negro ranks in the Human family below the two great Arab and Aryan races. Most of his contemporaries would have ranked these last in the inverse order, and the Negro, in mass, will not improve beyond a certain point, and that not respectable, he mentally remains a child. 15. It was in vain that certain African intellectuals, such as James Africanus Horton, attempted to overcome this attitude in the course of polemical exchanges with the influential members of the London Anthropological Society. Matters were made worse for the study of African history by the emergence at about this time, and particularly in Germany, of a concept of the historian's craft in which it became less a branch of literature or philosophy than a science-based and rigorous examination and analysis of the original sources. For European history, of course, these were predominantly written sources, and in these Africa seemed remarkably weak and deficient. The matter was put very succinctly when in 1923 Professor A. P. Newton gave a lecture to the Royal African Society in London on Africa and historical research. Africa, he said, had no history before the coming of the Europeans. History only begins when MBN take to 15. Opus Fit, 1893 The N, Volume 2, pages 131 and 135. 32. The development of African historiography. Writing. Thus the past of Africa before the onset of European imperialism could be reconstructed only from the evidence of material remains and of language and primitive custom, and such things were not the concern of historians, but of archaeologists, linguists and anthropologists. 6. In fact, Newton himself was somewhat on the fringe of the historical profession as it had emerged by his time. For much of the 19th century, some of the most eminent British historians, for example James Stephen I 789-1859, Herman Merivale 1806-74, J. A. Froude 1818-94, N.D.J. Art C. Lee 1834-95, I 7 had O.E.D. and vitally concerned with the activities of Europeans or of their compatriots at least in the wider world. But C. Lee's successor as a Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge was Lord Acton 1834-1902. Who had been trained in Germany. Acton began immediately to plan the Cambridge Modern History, the 14 volumes of which appeared between 1902 and 1910. This is Eurocentric to the point at which it almost totally ignores even European activities in the outside world. Following this, the writing of colonial history tended to be left to MBN like Sir Charles Lucas or, in France, Gabriel Ganottos 18 who, like Stephen, Merivale and Froude, had themselves once been involved actively in colonial affairs. In due course, however, colonial or imperial history became an accepted fringe of the profession. The new Cambridge Modern History, which began to appear in 1957 under the direction of Sir George Clarke, has African, Asian and American chapters throughout its 12 volumes, and by this time the range of the Cambridge histories had included the Cambridge History of the British Empire 1929-59, of which Newton was one of the founding editors. But only a very cursory inspection of this work is needed to show that colonial history, even when applied to Africa, is very different from African history. The CHDE's 8 volumes, are devoted to Canada, Australia, New Zealand and British India. This leaves 3 general volumes, which are strongly oriented towards imperial policy of their 68 chapters, only to have a very direct bearing on the British connection with Africa, and 1 volume which is devoted to South Africa, the one corner of sub-Saharan Africa in which European settlement took firm root. Virtually the 16. Africa and Historical Research Circumflex Accent Africa. Social, 22 1922-3 page 267. 17. Stephen served in the Colonial Office from 1825 to 1847 and was Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, 1849-59. Merivale was Professor of Political Economy at Oxford before following Stephen as Permanent Under Secretary of the Colonial Office 1847-59. Froude spent most of his life at Oxford and was Professor of Modern History there in 1892-4, but during the 1870s he served as an emissary of the Colonial Secretary in South Africa. C. Lee was Professor of Modern History at Cambridge from 1869 to 1895. 18. Lucas served in the British Colonial Office from 1877 to 1911, rising to Assistant Under Secretary. He subsequently held a fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford. Ganottos 1853-1944 followed to careers as a politician and statesman who in the 1890s played a leading role in French colonial and foreign affairs, and as a historian who was elected to the Académie Française. 33. Methodology and African Prehistory. whole of this volume, the largest of the 8, is devoted to the tangled affairs of these European settlers since their first arrival in 1652. The indigenous African peoples, the majority of the country's population, are relegated to an introductory and largely non-historical chapter by a social anthropologist, and to 2 chapters which, though written by the 2 most perceptive South African historians of their generation, C. W. D. Kiwiet and W. M. Macmillan, perforce view them in the perspective of their reaction to the European presence. Elsewhere, the history of Africa made a timid appearance in certain relatively monumental works, for example, Popolset Civilizations, Histoire Générale, 20 volumes, Paris, 1927-52, Histoire Générale, edited by G. Glotz, 10 volumes, Paris, 1925-38, Propagande dels Escopti, 10 volumes, Berlin, 1929-33, Historia Mundi, 9 Handbuch der Weltescopte Bern, 1952 fr. Vicemernages Historische World History 10 volumes, Moscow, I 955 ff. The Italian C. Conde Rossini published an important story at the Ethiopia in Milan in 1928. Professional colonial historians, then, like professional historians generally, were wedded to the concepts that the indigenous peoples of sub-Saharan Africa had no history, or no history that they could study or that was worth their studying. As has been seen, Newton regarded this history as the preserve of archaeologists, linguists and anthropologists. It is true that archaeologists, like historians, are professionally concerned with the past of man. But for a long time they were little more interested than the historians in applying their skills to discovering the history of human society in sub-Saharan Africa. There were broadly 2 reasons for this. First, one major strand in the evolving science of archaeology was that, like history, it is closely directed by written sources. It was devoted to problems like finding the site of ancient Troy, or finding out more about the societies of ancient Greece or Rome or Egypt than were already known from literary sources, and whose major monuments had for centuries been a source for speculation. It was, and sometimes still is, closely allied to the branch of the historical profession known as ancient history, and it is sometimes as much concerned with the finding and elucidation of ancient inscriptions as it is of other evidence. It was only very rarely, as in and around Aksum or Zimbabwe, that sub-Saharan Africa was known to have such major monuments as to attract the attention of this school of archaeology. A second major strand of archaeological research became focused on the search for the origins of man, and so with a spectrum of his past which was more geological than historical in its time scale. It is true that, with the work of scientists like L. S. B. Leakey and Raymond Dart, a major part of this search eventually became focused on eastern and southern Africa. But such men were concerned with a past so remote that society hardly existed, and usually there was a vast conjectural gap between the fossils they discovered and any modern population with whose past society historians might be concerned. 34. The development of African historiography. While archaeologists and historians largely held themselves aloof from sub-Saharan Africa before about the 1950s, its enormous variety of physical types, societies and languages inevitably attracted the attention of anthropologists handling with as their disciplines began to develop. It was for long possible for both to remain armchair sciences, but men like Burton and S.W. Cole Polyglotta Africana, 1854 had earlier demonstrated the value of fieldwork, and anthropologists in particular became the pioneers of this in Africa. But, unlike historians and archaeologists, neither anthropologists nor linguists have any essential compulsion to discover what happened in the past, and in Africa they found a wealth of data simply awaiting description, classification and analysis, all of which were major tasks. Very often their concern with the past involved nothing more than reconstructing the history that they thought would lie behind and explain their data. But they were not always aware how speculative and hypothetical these reconstructions were. The classic example is the anthropologist C. G. Seligman who, in his Races of Africa, first published in 1930, wrote bluntly, "The civilizations of Africa are the civilizations of the Hamites, its history the record of these peoples and of their interaction with the 2 other African stocks, the Negro and the Bushman. By inference, these 2 other African stocks are inferior, and any advances in civilization they have made are due to the extent to which they have been subject to Hamitic influence. Elsewhere in the book he writes of wave after wave of incoming pastoral Hamites who were better armed as well as quicker-witted than the dark agricultural Negroes on whom their influence was exerted. 20 But there is really no historical evidence whatsoever to support the generalization that the civilizations of Africa are the civilizations of the Hamites, or that the historical progress made in sub-Saharan Africa has been due to them alone, or even mainly to them. Certainly no historical evidence is advanced in the book itself, and many of the assumptions on which it is based are now known to be quite without foundation. J.H. Greenberg, for example, has demonstrated once and for all that, if the terms Hamite and Hamitic have any value whatsoever, they are at best categories of linguistic classification. 21 Certainly there is no necessary correlation between the languages which people speak and either their racial stock or their culture. Thus, inter alia, Greenberg can cite the marvelous example that the Hamitic-speaking agricultural houses are under the rule of the pastoral Fulani who speak the Niger-Congo i.e. Negro language. 22 He equally demolishes the Hamitic base for much of Zierligman's reconstruction. 19. Op. Cit. 1930 EDN, page 96, 1966 EDN, page 61. 20. Op. Cit. 1930 EDN, page 158, 1966 EDN, page 101. 21. J.H. Greenberg, 1963b. In fact Greenberg and most other modern linguists avoid the term Hamitic altogether. They place the so-called Hamitic languages along with the Semitic and other languages in a larger grouping called Afro-Asiatic or Erythrean, and do not recognize any significant Hamitic subgroup. 22. J.H. Greenberg, 1963b, page 30. 35. Methodology and African Prehistory. Of Negro Culture History in Other Parts of Africa, notably for the Bantu-speaking peoples. Zierligman has been singled out for attention because he was one of the leaders of his profession in Britain and one of the first to conduct serious fieldwork in Africa, and because his book became something of a standard work, which was often reprinted. As late as 1966 it was still being advertised as a classic of its kind. However, his espousal of the myth of the superiority of light-skinned over dark-skinned peoples was only part of the general European prejudice of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Europeans thought that their claim to superiority over black Africans had been confirmed by their own colonial conquest, and so in many parts of Africa, especially the Sudan Belt and the Lacustran region, they were persuaded that they were merely continuing the civilizing process which other light-skinned invaders, generally labeled Hamites, had begun before them. 23 The same theme runs through many other works of the period from about 1890 to about 1940 which contain much more serious history than can be found in Zierligman's little manual. For the most part these were written by MEN and WOMEN who had themselves been involved in the processes of conquest and colonization, and who were not professional anthropologists or linguists or historians. But because they were really interested in the exotic societies they had found, and wanted to find out more about them and to share their knowledge with others, they were amateurs in quite the best sense. Sir Harry Johnston and Maurice Delafosse, for example, both made really major contributions to African linguistics and to many other fields besides what the first called his major historical conspectus A History of the Colonization of Africa by Alien Races 1899, rewritten and enlarged, 1913, and the theme of the historical sections of the latter's magisterial survey of the Western Sudan, Goat Senegal Niger 1912 is set when he brings in a Judeo-Syrian migration to found ancient Ghana. For a tropical dependency, 1906 was bewitched by the Muslim contribution to African history. Marjorie Perham, the biographer and friend of Lord Lugard, appropriately refers to her majestic sweep of history from the first Arab conquests of Africa to those of Goldie and Lugard. 24. A very good amateur historian, Yves Dowie Histoire des populations du Soudan Central, 1936, and Histoire du Bornou, 1949 completely mistakes the significance of the interactions between Saharan nomads and Negro sedentaries that he accurately describes, while Sir Richard Palmer Sudanese Memoirs, 1928, and the Bornu Sahara and Sudan, 1936. An inspired antiquarian, is always seeking for springs of action in places as remote from these Nigerian themes as Tripoli or the Yemen. 23. It is a remarkable fact that the current revised 4th edition of Races of Africa 1966 has on page 61 the significant phrase that does not occur in the original text of 1930. The Hamites are there defined as Europeans, i.e. they belong to the same great branch of mankind as the whites. 24. M. Perum, I 960, page 234. 36. The development of African historiography. However, after Zerligmont, professional British social anthropologists largely escaped from the shadow of the Hamitic myth. The dominant influences on their training became B. Malinowski and A. R. Radcliffe Brown, who were very strongly opposed to any kind of conjectural history. In fact, the strict functionalist approach to African societies followed by British anthropologists in the 1930s and 1940s tended to discourage any historical interest, even when, through their fieldwork, they were in uniquely good positions to acquire historical data. However, on the continent of Europe and also in North America, not that many American anthropologists worked in Africa before the 1950s, an older tradition of ethnography continued, in which, inter alia, as much attention was paid to material culture as to social structure. This produced a considerable amount of work of historical importance, as for example toward Ir Stamps The King of Ghana 1944 or Lars Sundström's The Trade of Guinea 1965. However, two works deserved a special mention: Herman Bouwman's Volkerkunde Africa's 1940 and the Geschichte Africa's 1952 of Diedrich Westermann. The former was an encyclopedic survey of the peoples and civilizations of Africa in which due weight was given to what is known of their histories, and has still not been superseded as a one-volume handbook. The more recent Africa, Its Peoples and Their Culture History 1959 by the American anthropologist G. P. Murdoch, suffers in comparison because its author lacks in this field relevant first-hand African experience by which to evaluate his data, and because it is wedded to conjectural historical schema as Irk-centric in its OWM way, if not as pernicious as that of Zsigmond. 25. Westermann was primarily interested in language. His work of African linguistic classification often foreshadows that of Greenberg, and he contributed a linguistic section to Bouwman's book, but his Geschichte, unfortunately distorted by the Hamitic theory, is a very valuable compilation of the oral tradition of African peoples as they were available in his day. To these works one might perhaps add H. 8. Weeks chose the Zimbabwe Monomotopa Culture 1943 if only to introduce his mentor, Leo Frodenus. Frodenus was an ethnologist, a cultural anthropologist and an archaeologist as much as he was a historian, but in his period of activity, corresponding to the first 4 decades of the 20th century, he was almost certainly the most productive historian of Africa. He undertook an enormous amount of fieldwork in almost every part of the continent, and presented his results in a steady stream of publications. But these are little read today. He wrote in German, a language which has since become of decreasing relevance to Africa and Africanists. Relatively few of his works have been translated, and their meaning is often difficult to translate because they are encumbered by mystic theories relating to Atlantis, to an Etruscan influence on African culture, and so on. 25. C.M. Review article, Anthropology, Botany and History, 1961. 37. Methodology and African Prehistory. The highly professional historians, archaeologists and anthropologists of today, Frodenus seems the self-taught eccentric whose work is flawed not only by his outlandish interpretations but also by his rapid, crude and often destructive methods of fieldwork. But he did get results, some of which clearly anticipate those of later, more scientific investigators, and others which may be difficult or impossible to reproduce in modern conditions. It would seem that he had an instinctive flair for winning the confidence of informants and for establishing historical data. Modern historians might be well advised to rescue this data from his works, and to re-evaluate it in the light of modern knowledge and free from the more fanciful interpretations he placed upon it. 26. The eccentricities of a self-taught, self-inspired genius like Frodenus tended to confirm the academic historians in their view that African history was not an acceptable field for their profession, and to divert attention from a good deal of serious work that was being done during the colonial period. A factor of some importance was that the growth of the European interest in Africa had given Africans themselves a wider range of literacies in which to express their own concern for their own history. This was especially the case in West Africa, where the contact with Europeans had been longest and most consistent, and where, especially perhaps in the zones which became British colonies, the demand for European schooling was established by the early years of the 19th century. Just as the Islamized savants of Timbuktu had quickly set to write their tarikhs in Arabic, so by the later 19th century Africans who had become literate in the Roman script felt the need to set down what they knew of the histories of their peoples, before these were totally engulfed by the Europeans and their history. Early classics of this genre, written by Africans who, like the others of the tarikhs before them, had become active in the religion of the incoming culture and had taken their names from it, were Carl Christian Riehendorf's A History of the Gold Coast, and Samedi 1895 and Samuel Johnson's History of the Yorubas completed 1897, though not published until 1921. These are very serious works of history indeed. Even today, no one can embark on any work on Yoruba history without consulting Johnson. But it was probably inevitable that essays at history on this scale were to become entangled with the writings of the early proto-nationalists, from J. A. B. Horton 1835–83 and E. W. Bleeden 1832–1912 to J. M. Sarbor. 26. It is impossible in a short chapter such as this to do justice to the immensity of Frodenius' output. His final work of synthesis was Kulturgeschichte Africa's 1933 and his greatest achievement probably the 12-volume collection Atlantis, Vorkastmarchen und Vorkastzeitungen Africa's 1921–8. But account should be taken also of the books reporting his individual expeditions, e.g. for the Yoruba and Mossi und Africa's branch 1912–13. See the full bibliography in F. Kretschmer, 1968. Some recent articles in English, e.g. J.M. Ita, 1972, and works there referred to suggest a revival of interest in Frodenius' work. 38. The Development of African Historiography 1864–1910 J.E. Kafley Hayford 1866–1930 and J.B. Dankoff 1895–1965 who touched on many historical matters but usually for purposes of their propaganda. Perhaps J.W. D. Graft Johnson Towards Nationhood in West Africa, 1928, Historical Geography of the Gold Coast, 1929 and E. J. P. Brown The Gold Coast and Ancient Reader, 1929 belong to both categories. But after them there is a sense that a myth of the African past is being deliberately cultivated to combat the myth of European superiority. For example, J.O. Lucas, The Religion of the Yoruba 1948 J.C. D. Graft Johnson, African Glory 1954. Some European authors tended to push in the same direction, thus Eva L. R. Meyerowitz books on the Akan seek to give them a glorious Mediterranean ancestry comparable to that sought by Lucas for the Yoruba. On the smaller scale, however, much serious and sound work continued to be done by Africans in recording local historical tradition. The extent and depth of the contact with Christian missionaries seems to have been an important factor here. Thus Uganda has produced a considerable school of local historians from the time of Ikawa whose first work was published in 1906 onwards, while for Yorubaland, R. C. C. Law has noted 22 local historians who had published before 1940, often, as also with the Uganda authors, in the vernacular. The work of this kind which has become justly famous is J.U. Igareba's A Short History of Benin, which has passed through a number of editions since its first appearance in 1934. Secondly, of course, quite a number of the colonialists themselves were intelligent and inquisitive people who sought to find out and to set down the history of those they had come to rule. For such people, African history also often came to have some practical value. The Europeans might be better administrators if they knew something about the past of their subject peoples, and there was some need also for some African history to be taught in the ever-growing number of schools set up by them and their missionary colleagues, even if this was only to serve as an introduction to the more important tasks of teaching English and French history so that Africans could gain school certificates and baccalaureates, and so be enrolled as useful pseudo-European auxiliaries. Flora Shaw, Harry Johnston, Maurice Delafosse, Eve Dowie and Richmond Palmer have already been mentioned. Some others wrote serious African history which was relatively free of cultural preconceptions, even if sometimes they or their publishers chose remarkably inept titles. For example, Ruth Fisher, Twilight Tales of the Black Baganda 1912 ch. Stigand, The Land of India 1913 Sir Francis Fuller, A Vanished Dynasty, Ashanti 1921 fully in the tradition of Bowditch and Dupuy, E.W. Bobo, Caravans of the Old Sahara 1933 or the numerous scholarly works of Charles Monteil for example, Les Empires du Mali, first published 1929 or 39, Methodology and African Prehistory. Louis Tauxier for example, Histoire de Bambara, 1942. Perhaps the French were somewhat more successful in writing truly African history than the British, some of whose most solid works for example, W. Claridge's History of the Gold Coast and Ashanti 1915 or Sir John Gray's History of the Gambia 1940 though not some of the author's later East African articles tended to be solidly Eurocentric in their approach. It is also noteworthy that, when they returned to France, the number of the French administrators for example, de la Fosse, George Hardy, Henri Laboureur 27 essayed short general histories either of the whole continent or of all sub-Saharan Africa. Part of the explanation for this may lie in the fact that the French colonial administration tended to evolve more formal structures for training and research than did the British. A notable initiative was the Cognites d'études historiques et scientifiques de la Haute founded in 1917 and its bulletin, which led to the Institut Français d'Afrique, centered on Dakar 1938 and its bulletin and its series of memoirs, and so to works like Raymond Monet's magisterial tableau géographique de l'Ouest africain au Moyen Age 1961. But even so, the historians of the colonial period remained amateurs outside the mainstream of the historical profession, and this was just as true of France as of Britain, for although men like de la Fosse and Laboureur did return home to academic positions, it was as teachers of African languages or of colonial administration, and not as historians. In 1947, the Société Africaine de Culture and its journal Présence Africaine began to promote the idea of a decolonized African history. At the same time, a generation of African intellectuals, having mastered European techniques of historical investigation, started to work out its own approach to the past of Africa and to seek in it the sources of a cultural identity which colonialism had refused to recognize. These intellectuals also took the opportunity to refine and extend the techniques of historical methodology and rid it of a large number of subjective myths and prejudices. In this connection mention should be made of the symposium organized by UNESCO in Cairo in 1974, which enabled African and non-African researchers to engage in a free exchange of views on the problem of the population of ancient Egypt. In 1948, W. E. F. Ward's History of the Gold Coast appeared. In the same year the University of London created a lectureship in African history at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and appointed Dr. Roland Oliver to the post. At this point too Britain began a program of developing universities in its dependent territories. University institutions were founded in the Gold Coast and in Nigeria, and Gordon College in Khartoum and Makerere College in Kampala were promoted to university status. These developments were paralleled in the Belgian and French colonies. In 1950 an École supérieure de lettres was set up in Dakar and 27. M. de la Fosse, 1921, G. Hardy, 1937, H. Laboureur, 1946. 40. The development of African historiography became a fully fledged French university 7 years later. L'Avenium, the first university in the Belgian Congo now Zaire opened in 1954. From the point of view of African historiography the multiplicity of new universities from 1948 onwards was much more significant than the very few institutions which already existed but whose vigor was impaired by lack of funds, such as Liberia College at Monrovia and Fourabay College. In Sierra Leone, founded respectively in 1864 and 1876. In South Africa, the 9 universities which existed in 1940 were all handicapped by the segregationist policies of the Pretoria government. Historical research and teaching were centered on Europe, and the history of Africa was merely that of the white immigrants. All the new universities, however, quickly established departments of history which, for the first time, attracted a large number of professional historians to work in Africa. At first, Most of these historians inevitably came from non-African universities. But Africans rapidly took over. The first African director of a history department was Professor K. O. Dyke, who was appointed at Ibadan in 1956. White African students were trained. Professional historians teaching in Africa felt the need to add more African history to their syllabuses and, when such history was too little known, to explore it through their research. Since 1948, the historiography of Africa has become increasingly similar to that of any other part of the world. It has its own problems, for example, the comparative scarcity of documentary source materials for early periods and the consequent need to develop other sources such as oral tradition, linguistics and archaeology. But even if African historiography has made important contributions with respect to the use and interpretation of such sources, it is not fundamentally different from the historiography of other countries, in Latin America, Asia or Europe, which have to face similar problems. Furthermore, the actual provenance of his evidence is not fundamental to the main purpose of the historian, which is to make a critical and comparative use of it in order to produce an intelligent and meaningful description of the past. The important point is that during the last quarter-century groups of African academics have taken a professional interest in history. The study of African history is now a well-established, highly specialized activity and its continued development will be ensured by inter-African exchanges and by relations between the universities of Africa and those in other parts of the world. But it should be stressed that this progress would have been impossible without the process by which Africa threw off the colonial yoke, the armed revolt of Madagascar in 1947, the independence of Morocco in 1955, the heroic war of the Algerian people and the struggles for freedom in all. The African colonies contributed powerfully to this process because they gave African peoples the opportunity of renewing contact with their own history and organizing its study. UNESCO was quick to recognize this need and initiated or encouraged meetings of specialists. It also rightly insisted on 41. Methodology and African Prehistory, the systematic collection of oral traditions as an essential preliminary. In 1966, in response to the wishes of African intellectuals and states, it launched the idea of a general history of Africa, and the implementation of this major undertaking has been progressing under its auspices since 1969. 42. The place of history in African society. Bouhmandj. Kzrbo. MBN is a historical animal, and African MBN is no exception. Just as everywhere else all over the world, he created his own history, and his own idea of it. On the factual level, the proofs and products of this creative ability are there before our eyes in the form of methods of agriculture, cooking, pharmacy, law, political organizations, the production of art, religious ceremonies, and highly developed rules of etiquette. Through all the centuries since man first appeared, Africans have shaped an independent society which by its vitality alone bears witness to their historical genius. This history, which came into being empirically, a priori, was thought out and interiorized a posteriori both by individuals and by social groups. In this way it became an intellectual frame of reference, a spiritual and emotional authority, the reason and a setting for living, the model. But historical consciousness reflects the society to which it belongs, and even each significant phase in the evolution of that society, so it is clear that the Africans' conception of their own history and of history in general will be marked by their own particular development. The mere fact of isolation is enough to restrict a society's historical vision. Thus the king of the Mossi in Upper Volta used to bear the title of Madhonab, king of the world, a good illustration of the influence of technical and material limitations on people's ideas of social and political reality. One sees, then, that African time is occasionally a mythical and social time. But Africans are also conscious of being the active instruments of their own history, and, as we shall find, African time, as well as being mythical and social, is genuinely historical too. Mythical time and social time at first glance, and from many ethnological studies, one gets the impression that the Africans were submerged, almost drowned, in mythical time, the vast ocean without shores and without landmarks, while the other peoples of the world advanced down the avenue of history, a great highway marked out with milestones of progress. And it is true that myth, the imaginary representation of the past, does often dominate African conceptions of the development of the lives of nations. So much so, that the choice and methodology and African prehistory significance of real events sometimes had to obey a mythical model predetermining even the most prosaic actions of ruler or people. Myth, in the guise of immemorial customs, thus governed, as it also justified, history. From this context emerged two striking characteristics of African historical thought, its intemporality, and its essentially social aspect. In this situation, time is not duration as it affects the fate of the individual. It is the rhythm of the breathing of the social group. It is not a river flowing in one direction from a known source to a known outlet. In technically advanced countries even Christians make a clear distinction between the end of the world and eternity. This is perhaps because the New Testament differentiates between this fleeting world and the world to come, but it is also because for many other reasons human time has been to all intents and purposes secularized. But it is generally true to say that traditional African time includes and incorporates eternity in both directions. Bygone generations are not lost to the present. In their own way they remain contemporary, and as influential as they were during their lifetime, if not more so. In these circumstances causality operates in a forward direction, of course, from past to present and from present to future, not only through the influence of bygone facts and events, but through a direct intervention which can operate in any direction. When Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali 1312-32 sent an ambassador to the king of Yatega asking him to be converted to Islam, the Musi ruler answered that he would have to consult his ancestors before taking such a decision. This shows the past indirect connection with the present through religion, ancestors acting as special and direct agents in matters occurring centuries after their death. Similarly, that many royal courts officials responsible for the interpretation of dreams had considerable influence on political action, and might almost be described as ministers of the future. There is the well-known case of the Rwanda king, Natimpa Kawaya at the end of the 17th century who in a dream saw a pale-skinned man coming from the east. He took up his bows and arrows, but before letting flight he tied ripe bananas to the shafts. The interpretation of this dream attitude, at once aggressive and welcoming, and in short ambiguous, imparted a special image to the collective consciousness of the Rwanda people, and may have had something to do with the fact that although they were seasoned warriors they did not put up much resistance to the German columns in the 19th century, remembering the pale faces in the king's dream of a couple of centuries earlier. In this kind of suspended time, the present may even act on what is regarded as the past but in fact remains contemporary. The blood of sacrifices offered up today can help the ancestors of yesteryear. Right up to our own times, Africans have exhorted one another not to neglect offerings made in the name of their ancestors, for those who receive nothing are the poor in the parallel world of the dead, and have to live on the charity of those in whose name generous sacrifices are made. In a more fundamental way still, some cosmogonies attribute to some